segment we will discuss the concept of ethics, specifically as it relates to the health professions and medical writing. A good place to begin would probably be defining what is meant by ethics. Janie Butts and Karen Rich define ethics as a systematic approach to understanding, analyzing, and distinguishing matters of right and wrong, good and bad, and admirable and deplorable as they relate to the well-being of and the relationships among sentient beings. They go on to clarify the difference between ethics and morals. Morals tend to be developed and informed by our subjective ideas of what constitutes acceptable thoughts and behaviors, based on our cultural norms and beliefs. As you may have guessed, different cultural norms and beliefs exist among different peoples. So, what may be moral to one person is not to another. So, ethics requires people to support their beliefs and assertions with sound, logical reasoning. In other words, even if people believe ethics is subjective, they must be able to justify their positions through logical, theoretically based arguments. Of course, feelings and emotions are a normal part of everyday life, and can play a legitimate role in doing ethics, but some people allow their emotions to overtake their good reasoning at times, and when that happens, it does not provide a good foundation for ethics-related decisions. Evaluations generated through the practice of ethics require a balance of emotions and reasons. We tend to think of ethics as affecting our readers or employers, but establishing and adhering to ethical principles also protects you and your professional reputation. The textbooks provide a great deal of information on ethics and behaving ethically. So keep this in the back of your mind. Ethics sets the stage for your medical career or your research career. Following ethical principles means that you are trustworthy. So what's important for you to bear in mind as you enter the workforce? Your ethical and legal obligations include competence and diligence, having the training and experience to do your work with attention to detail and focus on the task at hand. Generosity, share your knowledge and expertise with colleagues, patients, caregivers, and other stakeholders. Honesty, report problems that may threaten the quality of service or patient care and report findings accurately. Confidentiality, as explained in the textbook, you must follow HIPAA regulations. You should also respect confidentiality of colleagues and caregivers as long as doing so does not put patients at risk. And loyalty. Put the patient's and the organization's best interests above your own. Well, these seem like reasonable standards, but how did they come into being? Who decided what was ethical, and how were ethics developed? In Western history, much of what became ethics as we understand it today generally began with the ancient Greeks, specifically with the philosopher Socrates, his student Plato, and Plato's student Aristotle. So the concept of medical ethics is rooted in the 5th century BC and in Rome in the 3rd century. Physicians continue to recite some form of the oath of Hippocrates to this very day. For example, they promise to benefit the patient, maintain confidentiality, and avoid harm. You may know that the person credited with founding modern nursing, Florence Nightingale, studied the Greek philosophers and supported their views on putting the patient in the best environment for the natural healing process to occur. The Roman physician Galen considered the study of philosophy to be essential to a physician's training because it enabled the physician to discern between truth and illusion, or between reality and mere surface appearances. This is very important in diagnosis and is also necessary for putting treatment on a sound ethical foundation. So as you can see here, Galen emphasized experience, observation, and logic, thereby maintaining a balance between emotion and reason. The Persian physician Rhazes, in his ethics book, indeed one of the very first books on medical ethics, stated that a physician should continue studying, advance scientific knowledge, and maintain a commitment to medical education, all of which are still done to this day. He recommended that physicians be virtuous and refrain from conceit, because the most important part in treatment is the dedication to the patients. And the first obligation is to treat patients kindly, not to be rude or aggressive, but soft-spoken, compassionate, and modest. Like Hippocrates, Rhazes stressed patient confidentiality. He also believed that physicians should encourage patients psychologically, even if there were no hope of recovering from their illnesses. To inculcate positive ideas into patients is an important method in modern psychology science. Like Galen, Rhazes considered it a physician's duty to treat patients equally regardless of their wealth. And as I am sure you know, that remains a policy in hospitals today. Rhazes said that the aim of the physician should not be the money he will get after treatment, but the cure, and physicians should be even more eager to cure the poor and homeless than curing the rich. He explored the effects of hygiene and a good diet, which were both very unusual concepts at the time, and he clearly had a sense of humor. For instance, one of his books was called Why People Prefer Quacks and Charlatans Over Skillful Physicians. He's best known for making the first descriptions of smallpox and measles. One of his other books was Al-Halwi, the Comprehensive Book, which was a 23-volume encyclopedia, collecting all medical knowledge from the known world at the time, even covering diseases of the skin and joints. Rhazes' contemporary, Avicenna, wrote a medical textbook called Al-Qanun, the Canon, a majestic synthesis of Greek and Arabic medical thought. The range of diseases and disorders considered was vast, from anatomy to purges, tumors to fractures, the spreading of disease by water and soil, and the book codifies some 760 drugs. The Qanun also pioneered the study of psychology, in that Avicenna observed a close association between emotional and physical states, the beneficial role of music in healing, and the role of the environment in medicine, which was rudimentary epidemiology. And he viewed medicine as the art of removing impediments to the normal functioning of nature. So you could say he gave the discipline its philosophical grounding. In the 12th century, the Qanun was translated into Latin by Gerard of Cremona, and together with Rhazes' book Al-Halwi, they served as basic textbooks in European medical schools until at least the 17th century, well over half a millennium. I could go on, but it's a very long history, and entire books have been written on the subject in a far more interesting manner than I could tell you in our allotted time. But for our purposes, it's enough to say that the codes of ethics for physicians continued to be refined and developed, leading to the American Medical Association Code, first published in 1847. But what about nursing? Aside from the Nightingale Pledge, one of the early codes of ethics specifically for nurses was Isabel Hampton Robb's Nursing Ethics for Hospital and Private Use. It was first published in 1900, right at the dawn of the 20th century. There were many other historical events in the 20th century which inform our view of ethics in the 21st century. Earlier I mentioned the difference between ethics and morals. Throughout history, people, based on their cultures and beliefs, have engaged in actions they believed were moral and proper. But as more evidence was revealed and better reasoning was developed, we find these actions are immoral. For instance, no one uses leeches as treatment for various illnesses today, but it was common practice as recently as 250 years ago. During the Second World War, Nazi concentration camp residents were often subjected to medical experiments that we consider barbaric today. Joseph Mengele, dubbed the Angel of Death at the Auschwitz camp, remains the most infamous symbol of these experiments to this day. The Nazi experiments and the trials held at the end of the war led to the Nuremberg Code of 1947, which established provisions stipulating that no human being could be subjected to medical experiments without his or her knowledge and consent. Moreover, the research had to be for some benefit for humankind and had to be stopped if there were a clear danger to participants. On a similar note, the World Medical Association conference was held in 1964 in Helsinki, Finland. That code established what became known as the Helsinki Declaration, and it governs clinical trials. Why is there a 10-year gap between the Helsinki Declaration and the U.S. National Research Act? The main reason is the Tuskegee experiment, an infamous chapter in American medical history. The U.S. Public Health Service conducted a clinical study between 1932 and 1972. Their subjects were poor and mostly illiterate African American men, who were told they would receive free health care and survivors' benefits in exchange for enrolling in the study. 600 men signed up, and 399 of them were infected with syphilis. Those who were not infected were considered a control group. The syphilis-infected men were never told they had syphilis. Even after penicillin was discovered and available as an effective treatment, these men's syphilis remained untreated, and they had infected any sexual partners they had in the meantime. The experiment was only halted after a story about it appeared in the press, and the resulting public outcry led to the U.S. National Research Act of 1974. The 1979 Belmont Report was developed in part as a response to the Tuskegee experiment. Its purpose was to establish guidelines for future experiments involving human subjects. Even with all these safeguards now in place, ethical questions and dilemmas haven't gone away completely. For instance, the Nuremberg Code stipulates voluntary consent to medical research, which means children and other vulnerable populations cannot participate. The Belmont Report points us in the right direction with 3 fundamental ethical principles for using any human subject for research. Respect for persons, protecting the autonomy of all people and treating them with courtesy and respect, allowing for informed consent. Researchers must be truthful and conduct no deception. Beneficence, the philosophy of do no harm, while maximizing benefits for the research project and minimizing risks to the research subjects. And justice, ensuring reasonable, non-exploitative, and well-considered procedures are administered fairly and equally. In other words, a fair distribution of risks and benefits to potential research participants. There are a number of regulatory frameworks in place to identify acceptable and unacceptable risks in the kinds of research for which patients and guardians can give permission. In the USA, the balance of risks and benefits is evaluated by an Institutional Review Board, or IRB. IRBs are charged with examining studies and determining whether there is an acceptable balance of risk and potential benefit. One of the principles for respect of persons requires that those who are unable to consent have protections, such as a parent or other guardian. In the case of a child, the parent usually adopts this rule and is presumed to act in the child's best interests. We also have an International Council for Laboratory Animal Science, which governs how animals are used and treated in experiments. As you may recall, Butts and Rich defined ethics as an approach to understanding, analyzing, and distinguishing matters of right and wrong, etc., as they relate to the well-being of and relationships among sentient beings. We are increasingly finding that animals are indeed more sentient than we have given them credit for being in the past, so it's very important to have this council governing research practices. As outlined in the Belmont Report, clinical research must uphold three central ethical principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Minimal risk is generally accepted to mean that the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater than that encountered in the course of everyday life or doing routine physical or psychological exams or tests. The idea of minimal risk may depend on context. For instance, an office worker may view minimal risk quite differently than a construction site manager. But whether the research project is requiring a risk from a therapeutic or non-therapeutic procedure, the IRB must consider whether the risks are proportional to the knowledge that may reasonably be gained. So, researchers must obtain IRB approval before beginning a research project, and they must clearly describe all risks, even those considered minimal, to research subjects, allowing them or their representatives to provide informed consent. We can define conflict of interest as a set of conditions in which professional judgment concerning a primary interest tends to be unduly influenced by a secondary interest. The purpose of rules on conflict of interest is to maintain integrity of professional judgment and to maintain confidence in professional judgment. So, when healthcare officials conduct research, they have two goals: to provide individual care in the patient's best interest and acquire generalizable knowledge. The AMA has developed codes of ethics and policies to explain what to do when confronted with an actual or potential conflict of interest. What about for-profit clinical research organizations? Well, there's definitely greater risk of conflict of interest, and we have to be concerned about scientific independence. Therefore, the two goals are not the same and can present a conflict for the researcher. So it's important to establish the objective of what is called equipoise, which is genuine uncertainty about the merits of new treatment versus an established one, which means no one will be disadvantaged. For instance, you may know that the clinical trial for Iressa, a lung cancer drug, was halted early because the merits of the new treatment were established, and the manufacturer did not want to delay getting the treatment to those who would respond to it. Here are a few examples of conflicts of interest. Financial conflicts. For instance, suppose a researcher is conducting a clinical trial on a drug manufactured by Pfizer, and if the researcher or family members have investment interests in the company, it represents a conflict of interest because it may affect how the researcher will enroll subjects, how they will identify adverse events, or interpret data or results. Authorship conflicts. Well, as explained in the Hefferon textbook, each author must participate sufficiently to take responsibility for all or part of the work. This means that each author must make a meaningful contribution to the experiment's concept, design, and generated data analysis. Each author is responsible for drafting the article and revising it for important intellectual content, and each author is responsible for approving the final manuscript before it's published. Research sponsorship and compensation. Well, most research requires funding, and some funds come from government agencies such as the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health, while other funding can come from private foundations or universities. And as I just stated, pharmaceutical firms also invest in research. So researchers need equipment and supplies, but they also need to make a living while they're conducting their research. So physicians who give up seeing patients to conduct a clinical trial need compensation for lost income. And concerns about scientific integrity have led to guidelines on the interactions between healthcare professionals and the pharmaceutical industry. There may also be conflicts of interest in institutions. For instance, they often compete for industry or government funding to pay for research. They may also form commercial partnerships to share in profits. As you can imagine, there is concern that these close ties could lead to ethical violations. For instance, finder's fees, which are payments for referring patients to research studies. The AMA widely criticizes this practice, and paying a physician simply because he or she referred a patient for a clinical trial is considered unethical. Patients who are in research should also be informed of who or what organization is funding the research. If there are fees, they must be approved in advance by the IRB. And confidentiality. Intellectual property laws may restrict the release of study results so that the company can prevent information from being used by its competitors. Let's turn now to a few takeaway points. Research involving infants, children, and adolescents must be undertaken to provide them the same potential benefits as adults. The concept of risk in child populations must include a consideration of non-minimal risk for non-therapeutic research. There is no moral reason to exclude high risks in therapeutic research as long as there is clinical uncertainty over whether a treatment will be beneficial. The definition of minimal risk is contextual. Researchers must discuss the project in a way that their subjects or their representatives can understand. In other words, they need to know exactly what is going to happen. This is a big part of informed consent. So, for that reason, you need to be very careful about using euphemisms. Researchers, research institutions, and ethics committees can experience conflicts of interest. All research must be approved by an appropriate ethics review body before it begins. Researchers must disclose any actual, perceived, or potential conflicts of interest to the Research Ethics Committee. That committee must evaluate the actual, perceived, or potential conflict of interest, assess the seriousness of any harm that may result, and determine the best course of action. Researchers must avoid signing any contracts which may cause them to violate ethical or legal responsibilities to research subjects. We'll conclude with a list of resources that you may want to read or view for additional information on the history of ethics and how our definitions of ethics have evolved.